So I am very, very, very thrilled to introduce Angie Hattery, the 2019 Feminist Lecturer. Angie's been teaching, researching, and writing about issues of gender-based violence for more than 30 years, since she was in college, in fact. Her work spans a range of issues, including sexual violence and intimate partner violence, and it relies on a variety of methods, including in-depth interviews, surveys, and analysis of secondary data. For the last 20 years, she's been teaching and writing about race and the criminal legal system, again, using a variety of methods, including in-depth interviews and quantitative analysis of data sets. Tonight, her talk entitled Gender-Based Violence Among Intimate Partners, Institutional Betrayal and the Carceral State, will focus on the point of intersection between these two strands of her research. Specifically, she'll illuminate the ways in which gender-based violence is produced at the individual, institutional, and state levels by focusing on two cases, institutional betrayal and the carceral state. Tonight, we will hear about the experiences of real people in their own words who have experienced sexual and intimate partner violence, both as victims and survivors and perpetrators, as well as the role that institutions and the state played in facilitating and exacerbating the impact of the violence. The topics Angie explores are really difficult, but they couldn't be more timely. So please join me in welcoming Angie Hattery, Professor of Women and Gender Studies and co-director of the Center for the Study and Prevention of Gender-Based Violence at the University of Delaware, the 2019 Feminist Lecturer.
Wow, thank you so much, Heather. And it's so amazing to see so many of you here. I wish I could see all of you in one place, but that's for another day and another time. I'm gonna screen share because I have some PowerPoint slides and they will help me, if nothing else, to keep on track. So let me get that going. Desktop, we all know how to do this. And then I'm going to get the slideshow up. Okay. All right, now I'm feeling more grounded. So again, thank you so much, Heather, for the generous introduction and for being willing to do it, especially on a little bit of a timely, short time turnaround. Like everyone else, I would also like to start with a few acknowledgements and some thank yous. I put the names up on the slide, but I have a few things to say about most people's names who are here. Barrett, for the third or fourth time today, people are going to thank you. Nothing happens, as I have learned, in SWS without Barrett. So thank you, Barrett, for everything you have done, including answering my last-minute questions as recently as probably this morning. That's classic Barrett. Fantastic meeting, and I'm super excited. Again, I wish I was with you all in Jacksonville, but it's really fantastic to have so many folks in the room tonight to celebrate SWS 50 years. Emily Kane. Emily Kane is my PhD advisor, my mentor, close friend, someone I've known for very many years. You're going to hear Emily's name come up a few times in the presentation, but Emily took me in when I was a first-year graduate student, and she was a first-year assistant professor. I think I probably showed some promise, but didn't have a lot of skills. And Emily trained me and supported me and, prepared me to be able to do the work that I do today. So nothing sort of really happens without Emily's influence. Emily's mentoring model is you're got to figure it out for yourself. And so I appreciate her positioning me so that I could start to figure it out for myself. Pat Merton, another familiar name. Many of you will probably have thanked Pat Merton. I'm not sure if Pat is here today, but Pat is important in the development of my work for a couple of reasons. The first is that she wrote a piece in 1989 on college, sexual assault on college campuses. And it was one of the first pieces I read that influenced my master's thesis. And so her work has been an important part of mine, really very much from the beginning. And like many of you, Pat was incredibly welcoming and warm when I started coming to SWS. I remember being starstruck, meeting her for the first time time. I think it was in a luggage carousel in an airport in some city that I don't remember where. And she was generous and welcoming and kind. And she also saw some potential. And she's the first person that asked me to consider a leadership position in SWS. So really, she's also had a big impact on my work and also on my time in SWS. Allison Monterosa. Allison is, I want to thank Allison for being a thought partner. Allison is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Riverside, who also does work at the intersections of intimate partner violence and the carceral state. She does really fantastic work. If you're looking to hire someone, Allison is on the market. I highly encourage you to check her out. And you're going to see some of the work that Allison and I are thinking about near the end of the presentation. Kate Kafanik. Kate, as you heard, is a graduate student and PhD candidate at the University of Delaware, working in the Center for the Study and Prevention of Gender-Based Violence. She is also doing fantastic work. Her work is looking at sex ed as prevention strategies for IPV. She's also on the market. So again, if you have a job position, keep these two folks in mind. Kate's going to be managing the chat, and so I'm really grateful for her work doing that so that I can ignore the chat. I'd love to thank and welcome my new colleagues, Patricia Sloan-White and Jennifer Nacarelli. Patricia Sloan-White is the director of the Women and Gender Studies, or the chair of the Women and Gender Studies department at the University of Delaware, and Jennifer Nacarelli is associate professor, associate chair, and also my co-director at the new Center for the Study of Prevention of Gender-Based Violence. I have a lot to thank them for, including them taking a chance on me, bringing me to the University of Delaware, welcoming me with open arms as much as one can during COVID. And Jennifer has really been the kind of thought partner that I needed to be able to think about the work that I'm going to be presenting tonight. And it's my first formal presentation as co-director of the center. So I feel like this is kind of a big deal for our center, and I'm excited to talk more about that later. Heather again. Heather is everywhere. Heather is influenced so many of us. Thank you, Heather, not just for the introduction, but for believing that I was someone who could be successfully nominated for this award. It blows me away. Wow. I can't say enough. I'm really just without words. But also the other members of the committee. Heather really spearheaded the nomination, but Krista Brumley, Adia Harvey-Wingfield, Shannon Davis, Emily Kane, and Deb Cohan all participated in making it a successful nomination. Travis, Emma, Porter, Marina, Daniel, and Aziz, you are the reason. So thank you for always helping me keep in mind why do this work. And Earl Smith, partner in all things. I would not be here without Earl Smith, and tonight I'm the one behind the microphone and I'm the one on the camera, but really this is our work. And you'll hear me refer to it often collectively. So Earl Smith, thank you for all of it. All right, let's get started. This is a quote that I wanted to start off tonight. I used to say my classmate attacked me, but I was raped on my campus. This is a comment that one of my classmates from college made many years after we had graduated. I want to use this as a way of talking about my positionality. When I was a college student, and it wasn't all that long ago, although some of you in the room hadn't been born yet, but when I was a college student in the mid-'80s, on a campus, there were a lot of things that were different than they are today. We didn't have sexual misconduct policies. We didn't have peer advocates. We didn't have a sexual assault response office. We didn't have any of those things. We didn't even use that language. And so some of my friends and I got together and we formed a activist group. We call ourselves SMASH, Student Movement Against Sexual Harassment, and apologize for the language, but that was the language of the day. We tried to transform the culture. We wrote a sexual harassment policy, presented it to the administration. We taught ourselves, we trained ourselves to be peer advocates. We brought people like Catherine McKinnon to campus. We tried everything we could do to shift the needle on gender-based violence so that students coming after us wouldn't have to have the same experience. Our 30th year reunion was a couple of years ago, and we all got back together and started to think about, well, what's happening on our college campus today? And although the language has changed, we now talk about not gender-based violence, we talk about other forms of violence like financial abuse or stalking. We've opened the tent to be far more inclusive than it was in the 1980s, recognizing so much of the violence that's perpetrated against trans and non-binary folk. But the numbers haven't changed. We have not moved the needle on gender-based violence in those 30 years, despite all the work that we did and all the aspirations that we have. In fact, as I reflect back, my daughter, Emma, went off to college, onto a campus no safer than I had been when I went off to college decades before. I do this work not only to make campuses safer, but so that everyone, regardless of their gender or gender identity, can live, work, go to school, and form relationships that are free of violence. That's my why. And I want you to think about this quote, because this really sets the tone for part of what I want to talk about tonight. I used to say my classmate attacked me, but I was raped by my college. That speaks volumes, right? So the work that I'm going to talk about tonight comes into frame from a variety, it's not one study, right? It's a variety of studies, scholarly work, more public-facing things, textbooks. Ronnie Tishner has a chapter in The Social Dynamics of Family Violence, so thanks to Ronnie for that. But it's really, the talk tonight is really where my thinking is now after having worked on these issues for many years. I told you that we would hear about Emily Kane again. Early on, when I started doing interviews with folks that were living with partner violence, men, women, Black folks, white folks, folks in the South, folks in the upper Midwest, we had brought Emily to campus. At that time, it was in North Carolina, to talk about her honors program, which is really very progressive if you don't know about the honors program at Bates. And Emily and I were sitting around talking, and she was asking me about the research on intimate partner violence. And I was sharing with her some of the incredible stories that I had been hearing from people who were experiencing violence, who were perpetrating violence. And I was just, they're overwhelming, right? They're hard to sit with. They're hard to hold. And Emily looked at me and she said, but what about it is sociological? But what about it is sociological? And I woke up at 4:30 this morning with that question in my head again, but what about it is sociological? And I think the second question is, what about it is feminist? And that's what I want to talk about tonight, is the role of feminist sociology in exposing, as Pat Martin argues in her book, Rape Work, the role, the importance of a feminist sociological frame for unpacking and illustrating and illuminating the roots of gender-based violence, whether that's victim survivors' experiences, the reasons that perpetrators perpetrate, but more importantly, how institutions and the state play a role in creating a frame for gender-based violence, or a playing field or a field where it's ripe, and also how they perpetuate it through re-victimization, institutional betrayal, and through the state. So a feminist and sociological lens is really asking a different question. Many of you study gender-based violence a lot. Some of you study it a little bit. Maybe some of you just teach about it in an intro course. But just a couple of stats for us to be thinking about the impact of gender-based violence in our communities, our families' communities, in the country, in the world. I'm not the first person to say gender-based violence is epidemic. I'm also not the first person to say that gender-based violence is a significant threat to public health. 25 to 35% of girls and women in the United States and worldwide experience some form of gender-based violence. That could be stalking, that could be sexual violence, intimate partner violence, financial abuse, trafficking. All of those things are part of what we think about when we talk about gender-based violence. Men, boys are also victims. And people who are trans and non-binary have extraordinarily high rates of experiencing various forms of gender-based violence. It is a threat to public health. IPV homicide, so death at the hands of a partner or ex-intimate partner, is the leading cause of femicide. 50% of women who are murdered every year in this country were murdered by a partner or an ex-intimate partner. That's 2 9/11s every year. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. That's not taking anything away from the survivors of 9/11 or the victims of 9/11, but every 2 years, that many women in the United States are murdered by partners or ex-intimate partners. It's an important issue that we need to take more seriously. Oh, whoa, I lost my slides. There we go. What is gender-based violence? It's about gender, it's about power, and it's about violence. It should be obvious, but there's a lot of unpacking to do here. Gender-based violence is gendered in many different ways. Who are the victim survivors? Who are the perpetrators? There are patterns to gender-based violence. Women and girls are the majority of victims, although men and boys and trans and non-binary folk are as well. But even when boys and other men and trans and non-binary folk are the victims, men are almost always the perpetrators. So we have a pattern there. But this is where I feel like a lot of the research on a feminist approach to gender-based violence stops, by looking at the patterns. And what we're arguing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, is the fact that when we apply a feminist sociological lens, gender-based violence is about policing gender boundaries. It's about policing gender roles and gender expression. And I'm going to talk a lot more about what some examples of that are. Gender-based violence is also a tool for asserting masculinity. So this is a lot bigger sort of frame for thinking about what makes gender-based violence gendered. It's actually much less about the bodies of the people who are perpetrating and being victimized. It's about the framework, it's about the structure, and it's about the ways in which we police gender. It's about power. It's about the power to create and sustain hegemonic ideologies of gender. It's about the power to enforce gender roles and gender boundaries. It's about the power to restrict access to the opportunity structure and to be surveilled and supervised by the state. The person whose work helps me a lot here in unpacking power is the work of Goran Thurborn, a Swedish sociologist who argued that states and hegemonies have the power to dictate what is good, and what is possible. And when we think about gender being constructed through systems that define what is good, and what is powerful, it opens up a different way of thinking about the root causes of gender-based violence. It has us thinking about not so much the fact, although this is how it plays out, it plays out at the individual level. People hit people, people rape people, right? That's what happens at the individual level. But it's really about a reaction to or a response to gender expression, gender roles, gender performativity, right? And that's really what gender-based violence is about. That's what we're arguing here and what I'm going to talk a little bit more about tonight. One of the ways that we think about gender being performed, being socialized, how it transmits across generations, and there's a high rate of intergenerational transmission of violence. Boys who grew up witnessing violence in their homes are 3 times more likely to perpetrate it than boys who don't. In fact, boys who grew up witnessing violence are more likely to perpetrate it than boys who experience violence, which I think is a really profound statistic. We interviewed men who were perpetrating violence, and one of the questions we asked them was, if you have a son or you think you're going to have a son, what would you teach him? And the answers were all answers about masculinity. I would teach my son, don't get played. Women are there to hurt you. Women will take advantage of you. And men need to control women. So don't let that happen to you. Not so much by picking a good partner. Don't let that happen to you by policing, right? Policing the ways in which you behave and you allow her to behave. That's really powerful, right? And those systems of the hegemonic ideologies up here are transmitted down through these daily interactions between parents and their kids. Gender-based violence is violence. It's not sex, it's not a misunderstanding, it's not a disagreement. It's violence that is meant to police, and it's violence that is meant to express or perform, typically performative masculinity. It happens at the interpersonal level, it happens at the institutional level, and it happens at the state level. Policing gender at the interpersonal level. intimate partner violence, oh, that should say polices, not policies. Intimate partner violence polices bodies, both cis and trans bodies, through two mechanisms. One is rule enforcement and the other is role enforcement. Rule enforcement is where many sociologists who do, quote, family violence research live. That's the frame that they're operating under, whereas I'm arguing a feminist sociological lens has us thinking about role enforcement. And I want to use the example of a man we interviewed named Eddie as a way of illustrating the difference between rule enforcement and role enforcement. So Eddie's a Black man in his 30s. He grew up witnessing a tremendous amount of intimate partner violence. His mother killed his father. She shot him in the head in the driveway of their home. He went to juvenile detention as a teenager. And he emerges with, a lot of risk factors for perpetrating gender-based violence, witnessing it, time in juvenile detention. He has a felony record. He has difficult time getting a job. We asked Eddie about some of the arguments that he has with his partner, his wife. And he talks about, and one example being that they fight when she doesn't have dinner on the table at the time that he wants dinner on the table. So he wants dinner on the table at 6:15 and dinner's not on the table at 6:15. And so he beats her up. And I think I mentioned this, but in case I missed Eddie's a boxer. Eddie has actually, in a boxing match, killed his opponent in the ring. So when Eddie beats up his girlfriend or his wife, he does significant damage. He's beaten her beyond recognition. And you're thinking, okay, over the fact that dinner wasn't ready at 6:15. And where family violence theorists stop is to say, that's a form of punishment. If I beat her up when she doesn't have dinner on the table at 6:15, she'll get dinner on the table at 6:15, right? It's a sort of disciplinary frame. We argue that it's actually way more complicated than that, that what Eddie is doing is performing masculinity through an act of violence in order to police the gender performance of his wife. A wife is supposed to take care of her husband. A wife is supposed to cook. A wife is supposed to do all of those things around the home to make it a conducive place for her partner. So when she doesn't do that, she's not acting right. Right? She's not behaving under the rules and expectations of a woman and a wife. So he responds to that, which he perceives as a threat to his masculinity. She's not treating me appropriately, by engaging in violence, a form of performative masculinity, right? What better way to establish oneself as in power than through violence? And people like Tristan Bridges argue something very similar, right? That something very similar. So the difference between rule enforcement and role enforcement is really important and is a product of thinking through a different frame, thinking through a feminist sociological frame, as opposed to thinking through a family violence frame. So that's one example that comes to us from Eddie the boxer. Some people might be familiar with Guadalupe Diaz's book, Transgressed. That book, Guadalupe Diaz makes a similar argument about the policing of trans bodies, that it's about not performing masculinity or femininity according to appropriate standards, that's the trigger that's happening in intimate partner relationships in the trans community. Guadalupe Diaz and I disagree a little bit about the role in which a feminist lens can play in exposing that. Guadalupe Diaz says feminism doesn't go far enough. I actually argue if you take this notion of role enforcement and the policing of gender and gender expressions, we're actually talking about the same thing, just using different groups of people that we're analyzing. So moving up a level to institutions. In the book, Gender, Power, and Violence, we interrogated gender-based violence in 7 institutions, and those institutions are on the slide: fraternities, the military, sports, prisons, the Catholic Church, politics, and Hollywood. And you might be asking yourself, what do these things have in common? So these are what these things have in common. They are quasi or total institutions. They're fraternal. They have a fraternal culture. So in other words, my identity in the group is more important than my individual identity. The people in the group are my brothers. They're very hypermasculine that varies across. But if you think of the military, if you think of prisons, if you think of sports, if you think of fraternities, there's a lot of expression of hypermasculinity. They have active or healthy rape cultures. They're highly sex segregated, if not at the level of the sort of participant. So for example, in the Catholic Church, probably more women attend church than men attend, but at the level of the power structure, of the leadership, they're highly, highly gender segregated, and they all have internal systems of justice. All of these things are a brew for high rates of gender-based violence and an institutional response that perpetuates gender-based violence. I'm going to focus specifically here on a couple of institutions, and I want to think most specifically about gender segregation and hypermasculinity and how those things come together. So policing gender at the institutional level. College campuses. I think here of the ways in which in a fraternity, for example, or other kinds of structures like that, there are particular requirements for how men and women are supposed to behave, what roles they're supposed to fill, what they're entitled to do. Joan Spade writes about this in her piece on fraternity rape, and describes, fraternities and bars and other locations that are rape-free and some that are rape-prone. And the rape-prone fraternities and bars are those that are much more hypermasculine and also more focused on traditional gender roles. So that's important. On a college campus, you also have examples of the institution itself engaging in a form of violence against a student, in this case, a student who's a victim survivor of sexual violence. So she says, and this unfortunately is another one of my classmates, I arrived at college like so many other young people, eager to set out on my own and ready to get a good education. My years at college were not what I imagined they would be. I spent weeks preparing for the hearing and then years learning, educating about sexual assault. I worked to help to get the college up to speed on best practices. I now know that I repeated much of the work students had done a few years before, as there were no official records of their efforts. Like other survivors, I got away from campus, taking a year away so I could return and get a fresh start with a new class. M, who's the perpetrator, graduated on time, and she didn't. So what's the institutional violence here? The institutional violence is many things. First of all, she's re-victimized by the campus internal system, the internal hearing system, but it's also a form of violence, we argue, because she's denied access to the opportunity structure in a way that the perpetrator is not. He graduates on time. He goes on to get a job. She, in this case, does graduate, but many victim survivors don't graduate, or they change majors, or they take some time out of the market, or they don't, get the job that they thought they would have, or they don't move to the city that they thought they would want to, all because of this experience. 100,000 women are raped on college campuses each year, which means every 10 years, that's 1 million women who in some ways have their access to the opportunity structure blocked, not by the rape, as much as by the institutional response. So rather than studying for the SAT, she's trying to educate the campus about sexual assault policy. I think that's really telling when we think about the ways in which an institution can recreate and reproduce different sorts of violence on people who they claimed they were there to protect. Another example comes from the military. One of the things I want to mention about the military, it's highly sex segregated, gender segregated. It's highly hypermasculine. I think we saw that on January 6th in the Capitol coup. We saw many displays of hypermasculinity and of gender segregation. This is a quote from Janice Karpinski, and she's responding to an allegation that some women soldiers in Iraq had died of dehydration. And in fact, they had. And after a few years after she leaves her position, she discloses the women were dying of dehydration because they would not drink liquids late in the day. They avoided liquids due to their fear of being assaulted by their fellow soldiers, not the enemy, I might add, when they used the outdoor bathrooms in the middle of the night. Wow. So this is violence that's being perpetrated at the hands of individual people. but the institution is also engaging in violence. In this case, the women died because the institution didn't take the complaint seriously, didn't protect the women, didn't retrain people that, you know, this is not how you behave, this is not acceptable, didn't hold perpetrators accountable. We argue in the book that it's also something else, which is, and here we use some framing from Cynthia Fuchs-Epstein's argument about policing gender boundaries, that women who are attempting to integrate an institution like the military are challenging not just appropriate norms or behavioral expectations for women, they're also challenging power. They want access to an institution that they've been denied access to. And when they attempt to get this power, their fellow soldiers, in this case men, they don't beat them up, they don't hit them in the face, they don't do that, they rape them. So they engage in a particular act writ on their sexual and reproductive bodies that serves to not just to extract violence, but it serves to put them in their place. It serves to remind them, you don't belong here. It serves to send a message, this is for us, not for you. And so much so that these women end up dying of dehydration because they're afraid of being raped on the way to the latrine. That's like the student on the college campus, that's denying women an opportunity to earn a living. It's denying women an opportunity to advance. It's denying women the opportunity to, you know, do what they want to do with their lives. It's also a loss of human capital for the military, because these are highly trained people, right? And so what's interesting about the military is the more gender segregated the branch, the higher the rates of sexual violence. So the Marine Corps, which is only 6% women, has the highest rates of sexual violence, the highest rates of gender-based violence. And I think what's interesting about this example is we can also cross over and see how the same policies are used to police trans bodies. This reads like a bathroom bill, right? So we can think about trans students, for example, who might be walking around on our campuses and are dehydrated because they can't find a bathroom that they're supposed to use, or trans folks in a office or in the military engaging in the same kinds of behavior. I think that this is an interesting way in which we can think about how bodies are being policed by systems, not necessarily the bodies as individuals, but the bodies as challenging or transgressing or in any way behaving in ways that the box is not designed for them to behave in. So those are examples of institutional betrayal. Again, I want to reiterate, I think what's interesting about these is that sexual violence is the tool. It's not so much beating people up. In the case of women and trans folks, challenging gender boundaries in a workplace like the military or in a social space like a fraternity, the violence is almost always sexual violence, which speaks volumes about the ways in which this is gender-based violence. Oh, one more thing to add about the military, because I think this is interesting. If you are a victim survivor of rape in the military and your perpetrator is married, but you are not, you can be charged with adultery. And I'm going to say that again. So you're a victim survivor of rape in the military. The perpetrator is married, but you are not. You can be charged with adultery because sex outside of marriage is prohibited by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But whose body is policed? Whose expectation is policed? Whose gender expression is policed in that example? It's not the perpetrator who's married. It's the victim survivor who's not. And I think that's another example of the ways in which we can think about the power of defining gender hegemonies and the ways in which those get translated out and policed at the individual level. One more fact, 62 Human Rights Watch found that 62% of victims who reported a sexual assault in the military experienced retaliation. 62%, and that can be individual retaliation or it can be institutional retaliation, like being charged with adultery, which is a rate 12 times more likely than the perpetrator was to be punished. 62% of victim survivors reported retaliation, which is 12 times more likely than perpetrators were to be held accountable. I think that's really significant. So the carceral state. How do we wind up with the carceral state in a discussion about gender-based violence? There's a lot of ways that we can think about how we ended up here, but the story of how we ended up here is that when we were doing interviews with families living with intimate partner violence, one of the things that emerged pretty quickly was that incarceration played a significant role in the experiences of the Black folks that we were interviewing, and not so much in the experiences of the white folks. So that got us starting to think about, what is it about incarceration that produces or contributes to rates of intimate partner violence? So here we go. Talked a little bit about earlier about performative masculinity and performative femininity and expectations for men and women in relationships. The two that pop out most significantly in our research were expectations around the sexual requirement of the relationship and expectations around the breadwinning requirement of the relationship. And you can figure out sort of who goes in that bucket, but men are supposed to be the breadwinners and women are supposed to be these sexually available partners, right? That's sort of, that's what those boxes, how those boxes are constructed. So how that plays out at the individual level, this is the story of Chris and Wanda. And you can see there's a little language in here. This is way toned down from the original quote. I decided to sanitize some of it. So Chris is a Black man who we interviewed actually while he was in jail. And he has had a lot of problems. He's in jail at the particular moment because of intimate partner violence, but he's been in and out of jail. He has a series of felony records. And so when he comes back out of jail, comes home, he has a really hard time getting a job because of a set of systems that we've put into place related to the war on drugs. For example, it's very difficult to get a job. There's safety net programs are not available to people with felony records. You can't live in public housing. You can't get a student loan if you're a drug felon. You can't sometimes have a driver's license. There's a variety of things you can't do that are tied to that felony record. So he has a difficult time getting a job. Meanwhile, Wanda, who's a Black woman, is at home. She's going on with her business while Chris is incarcerated. And some of that involves her talking to other people. People stop by the house. So the transcript that you see here on the screen is an interchange that she relates and he confirms about a fight that they've had. So he's complaining about what's happening in the house and they get into a fight, and she threatens his masculinity by accusing him of not being a breadwinner. She's paying all the bills. She pays the rent, the gas, the light, the phone, the cable, everything. She even buys his deodorant, right? Which is really a dig. She even buys his deodorant. They have an argument about the house, and she again reasserts, challenges his masculinity, emasculates him, and he responds with performative masculinity by beating her up. In fact, he has a knife and he ends up stabbing her. A really, I think, poignant example of the way in which the carceral state and the restrictions it puts on Chris pop out or translate into creating an individual level violence in their relationship. The carceral state and IPV is sometimes not a direct interaction between the two people in terms of violence, as much as it is the carceral state putting pressure on the perpetrator in ways that expose the victim survivor to other forms of violence. So this is the first case is an interview with Will and Stella. Will's a crack addict. Will's got a set of felonies, and he's facing a 3 strikes you're out sentence. He's facing the possibility of life in prison if he gets busted for a 3rd crack possession and is convicted for that. So they relate this story where they're driving not together, but they both talked about it individually in their interviews. They're driving and the cops put on the light, right? So Will is being profiled. Will is being pulled over by a police officer because he's a Black man driving a car and maybe he has drugs. Will says to Stella, you got to take the drugs, because if you don't, you know what's going to happen if you don't take the drugs. I'm going to go back to jail, and we don't want that, do we? Will is not necessarily engaging in an act of overt violence. What Will's doing is because of the surveillance he's experiencing by the carceral state, he's exposing Stella to the violence of the carceral state herself, which is a sort of indirect way of thinking about the ways in which the carceral state creates violent exposure for women. In this case, the women of men who are justice involved, or I'm sorry, not justice involved, not using that language anymore, criminal legal involved. Kezia is another example. Kezia is somebody that we interviewed shortly after she got out of prison, where she had served a 5-year sentence for drug possession. She gave birth to her 5th child while she was incarcerated, which is a whole nother story that we can talk about, but talk about violence writ on the sexual and reproductive body. Shackling women during labor and delivery is a prime example of that. Kezia ends up in prison for the exact same reason. Her partner is facing 3 strikes, you're out. There's a drug raid in his apartment. And so he says, look, you got to say the drugs are yours, or I'm going back to prison for the rest of my life. She doesn't want him to go to prison. He doesn't have to hit her. He doesn't have to threaten. He doesn't have to do anything for her to agree to do that, because of the pressures on the over surveillance and the pressures of the carceral state on Black men, whose partners are then pulled into a system that wreaks violence on their bodies. Breonna Taylor. I want to mention there's other obvious examples of state violence, things like eugenics, things like the experimentation by J. Marion Sims, the birth control experiments that were done on young Black women's bodies in Baltimore. But one of the most sort of big in-your-face examples is the example of Breonna Taylor. And a lot of people talk about Breonna Taylor's case as an example of the police killing of an unarmed Black person. And it is the police killing of an unarmed Black person. But when we apply the lens that we've been talking about tonight in terms of thinking about the carceral state and violence against, in this case, violence against women, the partners of men, Breonna Taylor, yes, she is murdered by an unarmed police officer, but she's murdered because police, she's unarmed, murdered by the police, but she's murdered, although that is true, she's murdered because the police are hyper surveilling her intimate partner and her ex-intimate partner. Breonna Taylor might have been delivering some packages. Breonna Taylor might have been traveling back and forth between 2 apartments. Breonna Taylor might have given somebody a ride. I don't know much about the partner or ex-intimate partner of Breonna Taylor, but those are natural things that we might do for a partner, especially if our partner is criminal legal involved and can't drive because they have a driving restriction. They haven't gotten their license back. They're afraid to be busted. They're just constantly surveilled. So they ask their partner to do a simple task. The state responds to Breonna Taylor's intimate partner and ex-intimate partner with a militarized SWAT level, no knock warrant approach. They don't knock on the door and say, are there drugs in here? They don't knock on the door and say, oh, we saw you doing a drug deal. They assemble a SWAT team on 2 sides of town. If you haven't seen the New York Times expose of this, it's absolutely fascinating because they show footage, images, and then a time elapse of how things are unfolding that night. She's the victim of a no-knock warrant. She's the victim of the militarization of the police, not because someone asked her to do something, not because her partner beat her up, not for any of those reasons, because she chose to be with somebody whose body is over-surveilled, over-policed, and in this case, responded to by militarization. So what's the story of the carceral state? And this is where I want to thank my thought partner here, Allison Monterosa, and also Earl Smith. This is what we're thinking about right now. We're trying to think about how gender-based violence arrives and marks women's bodies through this less direct route of the over-policing of the Black men with whom they partner. It's a little bit of a different way of thinking about violence in the carceral state, of thinking about gender-based violence. And I think it's the illumination of this is the compilation of thinking about gender-based violence and bringing work on the carceral state into conversation with each other through an explicitly gendered and feminist and sociological lens. I think the beauty of thinking about all of those things together is what really moves this conversation in this direction. The last example I'm going to give is, we're seeing something similar in COVID. So many of you might have seen that the Supreme Court ruled last week that in order to get a medical abortion, you have to show up at the hospital or the doctor's office to take the first pill. Now imagine that you got, and we've been reading some of these blogs in, around in the blogosphere. Imagine that you got pregnant in February of 2020 and you really wanted to be pregnant. It was a wanted pregnancy. You worked hard to get pregnant. You did all kinds of things to get pregnant, and wow, you're excited. And now it's March and you are terrified, March of 2020. I didn't think I'd have to say that, but just in case. You are terrified about what this is going to mean in terms of your exposure to hospitals, to clinics. COVID is everywhere. Seems like a very dangerous time to have a baby. And so you decide that you want to terminate that pregnancy. Your partner and you are not on the same page. Your partner won't drive you to the clinic. Your partner won't let you take the car. It's not that your partner is beating you up. It's not that your partner raped you and that's how you got pregnant. It's not that your partner is engaging in those sorts of gender-based violence. But because of a state policy, in this case, that you have to show up in order to get the pill to terminate the pregnancy, you are exposed not only to a pregnancy that you don't want, but you're now exposed to COVID, which you don't want, because you've got to be able to go to the hospital to manage this medical situation that you're in. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about, ways in which COVID, the carceral state is changing and elevating the impact of gender-based violence beyond the individual, beyond the institutional, all the way up to the state level. So that's what I got. I am gonna stop the screen share so that we can have a robust, hopefully, conversation. I apologize, I went longer than I wanted, but I'm anxious to hear thoughts, feedback, comments, whatever Kate's got for us.
Hi, Angie. Thank you so much for
Hi, Kate.
and thank you everyone for coming. We have a lot of participants. It's very exciting. I'll start us off, and as I mentioned in the comments, please say anything, any thoughts, any reflections, any questions, and I'll keep track of them. But I'll start us off because Marcia Texler-Siegel actually brought this up too. I don't think I'm going to say Louisville correctly because I'm not.
Louisville.
But
okay.
Is that close enough?
Louisville.
Well, I was thinking of that and I was struck by your talk about Breonna Taylor because I remember talking about it when it happened. I have a family friend and her daughter is a homicide detective in the Metro District where it happened at the time. And she has since switched departments. She was not involved, obviously, in the actual no-knock warrant, but I remember hearing about her reactions to it and talking about your description of the fraternal institutions and all of those traits. I know we've talked about it exhaustively, but what do we do moving forward with changing kind of their attitudes towards what happened? I think there's kind of a defensiveness on her end when she was describing it, and she identifies as gay, and she already faces different difficulties and different barriers in the department along those lines as well. But just speaking broadly about her reactions to Breonna Taylor when it happened, they were kind of tense conversations that I've had with her about Breonna Taylor. So what are your thoughts, Angie, on how to kind of interpret and maybe reframe that fraternal attitude and mindset in the context of issues like Breonna Taylor?
That's a great question. I think my first thought is, and I meant to say this at the beginning of the talk, but I think I forgot to say it. I think I'm going to back into the question a little bit. I think part of the problem with the approaches that we've taken to disrupting gender-based violence is, and by we, I don't mean necessarily feminists and I don't mean advocates, but I mean we as a culture, is that we continue to define it as an individual problem. We continue to define it as two people who have a misunderstanding or don't get along or need to learn to count to 10 or have substance abuse issues or all of those things. And it is that at the individual level, but it's not about people. It's not about individual people. It's not about a cop that chooses to execute a no-knock warrant. It's about a carceral state that militarizes, that hyper surveils Black bodies, that defends people. Look at the data, and you can look in our book, Policing Black Bodies, look at the data on police officers who kill unarmed Black people. They are never held accountable, ever held accountable, right? So I don't think the solution is as much an individual one. The solution is a structural one. If we decarcerate, if we dismantle the militarized carceral system that we have in the United States, if we begin to think about solutions that are at the state and the institutional level, I think we get a lot farther. And I think, this will sound really cliche, but use the sociological imagination a little bit. The individual experience may or may not be indicative of what's happening at the upper level. It's not so much about individual behavior, although we need to hold individual people accountable. But I think that's sort of where I land on that. I'm saying some yes to defund and dismantle the police. And I think similarly, how do we address gender-based violence? It's not count to 10 programs. It's about blowing up the boxes. It's about blowing up, reconfiguring, dismantling hegemonic ideologies of gender. To start with, Judith Lorber, writ large. I'm not sure if Judith is in the room, but this is Judith Lorber, writ large, right? And it's about creating ways of interacting with people that don't tie behaviors to bodies or boxes. It's a similar kind of approach.
Yes, I think that definitely resonates. And it sounds like some of the things that I heard in our discussions about the event after it happened. And relatedly to couple violence and discussing that as an individual problem and how we think about it. Mignon asked what you and your thought partners think about some of Michael Johnson's past work, distinguishing between common couple violence and domestic terrorism.
That's a great question. I think this is a common question. I think in the sense of that's a intellectual debate that we've had to engage. I think situational couple violence and Mike Johnson and his colleagues' work is important. And I think that it tells us something about individual level behaviors and the ways in which couples navigate conflict. I think what's missing, and we have said this in many, many forums, written these kinds of exchanges, it's not informed, I argue, it's not as informed by a feminist, power-based, intersectional framework. So it focuses on two people who can't manage conflict, as opposed to focusing on gender role expectations, what happened, policing gender behavior, performative masculinity. It doesn't speak to any of those issues. And we can also set aside the piece that it doesn't really, their work is trying to separate intimate terrorism from situational couple violence. But I think it's asking the question at the wrong level. I think the question needs to be asked at the level of hegemonic ideologies, the boxes that we put people in terms of gender, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Andy, what do you think about overlapping various levels of structurally triggered gender violence and how it normalizes it socially and culturally, also seen in the case of gender violence against immigrants? And that's from Roberta.
Can you say it again? I got caught, the chat popped up and I got distracted.
Oh, yes. Regarding overlapping various levels of structurally triggered gender violence, and it normalizes it socially and culturally. So Roberta brings up gender violence against immigrants.
Yeah, I think many of it is all in the same, it all comes from the same root. It's not the same, it doesn't always look exactly the same, but I think the foundation of it is the same root, that immigrants are an example of, again, of people trying to push a boundary. They're trying to gain access to an opportunity structure that people who have the power to control that opportunity structure are not particularly interested in giving over, right? In giving back, in opening up for other people. So I think violence, I think a lot of the xenophobia is rooted in white supremacy, which is another system of hegemonic ideology that is interested in protecting the rights and privileges and structures and opportunities for white people and not opening those up for Black people, for immigrants, for other people of color. So I think they all are rooted in that nexus of white supremacy, patriarchy, and modern capitalism. And we can add to that, but at its sort of basic, fundamental level, those systems are mutually reinforcing and extraordinarily powerful.
Definitely, thanks. And along the lines of white supremacy and big, powerful institutions, we'll transition to colleges and universities. And Nona or Nana, please correct me if I'm wrong. She asks about, oh, there we go. Okay, about how we mobilize larger feminist and social justice movements for structural solutions and preempt backlash. So like you said, there is backlash happening. That counter movement has really co-opted Title IX that resulted in the Betsy Trump Title IX rule, that, for example. So speak a little bit about how we mobilize.
I love the question. I feel a little inadequate in addressing it from the perspective that I've tried mobilizing on college campuses for 30 years and the numbers haven't moved. So clearly what I'm trying to do or have done in the past isn't successful. I think as I was preparing for this conversation tonight, for me, moving the thinking beyond compliance, moving the thinking beyond even the activities among individuals and instead focusing on the boxes, on the constructions, on the expectations. This is a question that I always ask students that I have in class who are part of the Greek system. Why do the fraternities get to have beer and jungle juice and the sororities don't? And that puts the sorority women at a disadvantage because in order to participate in the social climate of the campus, they have to go to fraternity parties where they're at higher risk for being victimized by gender-based violence. Why is that the structure? Where does it come from? Why did it start that way? How can we disrupt that? And in some ways, then we would reduce the presence of gender-based violence. It's a complicated question. I think, Dr. Nacarelli and I were in several conversations today. How do you move an administration whose interest is in the status quo? And I don't just mean it's in, acting like rape doesn't happen on college campuses. The truth is they're patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist organizations who are invested in maintaining the status quo. So I think the days of saying, well, this many women were raped on campus and that's a lot of loss of alumni dollars, I don't think that's even going to work. I think it's got to be really a different frame that looks at dismantling those systems. That's not a very satisfying answer probably because it's not very practical, but I've been trying for a long time. I would love to hear other people's ideas because I've been trying for a long time.
Well, Roberta, from before with the immigration question, gender violence against immigrants, wants to point out and agrees with you, but moving the needle, what she thinks we've done is move the needle over gender violence, agrees with you that we need to do more to finally be able to eliminate GV, as you just said, and the context of crises never help as it all becomes more violent, but she believes it's more important and valid to acknowledge that the collective work that's been done about gender violence has also been effective to keep a transnational and historical perspective, keep on pushing towards understanding and better eliminating gender violence.
Yeah, I thank you, Roberta. I agree with that. Absolutely.
Susan asks, how can we help boys develop in a more healthy way so they do not develop overwhelming anxiety about masculinity? For example, efforts in schools, TV programs aimed at children, etc. I was thinking about this as well when you were talking about Eddie the boxer right away.
Yeah, I think there are many things, and there are some progressive programs that deal, for example, with consent that are taking place in the Netherlands, teaching consent, teaching healthy relationships at a young age. And I think for a really long time, I focused on thinking about those as really effective solutions. And as my thinking has been evolving, especially trying to think about gender-based violence in the carceral state, I think it's about teaching boys that being masculine is being supportive, that being masculine is being a good partner, that being masculine is nurturing and comforting and all that stuff. And it's really about, again, kind of come back to the same theme, but it's really about, why can't we blow up masculinity and femininity? Not to use a violent term, but why are, the structures themselves are largely what's causing the problem. Dr. Nacarelli and I were talking earlier today. Students ask me this all the time. Well, what's the answer? Is the answer that men should do the cooking and women should mow the yard? And my answer to that is, people in a relationship or household should be assigning roles and responsibilities based on ability and interest. So who's ever cooking in the house, let's hope it's the person that's better at it and the person who likes to do it, and not assign that to one gender or another gender. We should be thinking, so if we were training boys and girls, what would we train them? First of all, let's just get rid of the boxes. We should be training them to be smart, curious, creative thinkers, and pursuing passions and interests, and not tying those specifically to these constructions of masculinity and femininity. I could go on, but I think if other people want to chat more about that, I really think it's about disrupting the boxes.
I think I could chat with you more and more about that later.
That would be fun.
My dissertation research, because we see that in prevention as well, and looking at gender norms and how early that starts. Masculinity plays a huge role in prevention programming. Diana mentions COVID and the impact on abortion, as you were bringing up towards the end of your talk. COVID exacerbates the long-term problem, sorry, the chat moved. COVID exacerbates the long-term problem of being required to travel to get the abortion pill in person. Many women live in abortion deserts. Travel imposes costs, but also one must tell or get help from partners, employers, childcare providers, etc. So state and institutions perpetuate this violence on women, quoted.
Absolutely. And I think, again, I want to return to, it's that violence, and it's also the violence of being exposed to a deadly virus, which is a more indirect way of thinking about the impact of the state in terms of violence on bodies. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And Astra also expands that perspective about the household, saying gender roles in the household get very confusing and complicated in a polyamorous household with more than two people.
Absolutely.
Susan asks, Angie, can you talk more about sports and socialization? For example, to what extent does football teach hegemonic masculinity?
A lot, Susan. A lot. We do a whole chapter in Gender, Power, and Violence on Sport, and we focus specifically on football and men's basketball, where hypermasculinity is really the name of the game. And it's multiple forms of hypermasculinity. It's the physical violence. If you watch a football game, it's very, very, very violent. Men are rewarded for violence on the field. That's that's how they can make more money, or they can get more opportunities. Sports like that are also very hypermasculine in terms of expectations around hypersexuality, drug and alcohol use, and all of the things that become a mix. They're also, we argue in the book, at least at the elite levels, if we're talking about college and professional sports, probably also high school sports if they're very competitive, the only roles that women play in those environments is as some sort of service to the player. So women aren't, for the most part, aren't coaches. They're not even often athletic trainers. There's no, men in those institutions have no collaborative, equal, non-hierarchical relationships with women. Women are there as cheerleaders, as, people to do your homework, as people to, take your test for you, and as sexual servants. And so the way in which hypermasculinity gets produced and reproduced in sports is deeply troubling, and something that we should spend a lot more time thinking and talking about.
And the Seattle Seahawks suspended a player today for IPV.
Wow, that's unusual.
And I am from Baltimore, so I hear a lot about the Ravens in the news, so familiar with that as well. Barbara asks if you could comment a bit more on the role of the military, particularly not only in terms of gender-based violence inside the institution, but the impact on women and men in other countries. And what's the relation between these two aspects? Is there a place for a call to defund the military and moving resources to social needs? I think you talked about this a little with the Capitol insurrection, but moving it on a more global scale, Barbara asks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely. I think again that whether it's the military is a great example, rooted in patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy. Those same tactics get used in all kinds of different ways. And sometimes they're used on, co-members of the military, but they're also used when we colonize, they're used when we go to war, they're used when we police the borders, they're used in all of those same places. Again, go back to Cynthia Fuchs Epstein's piece, policing boundaries is about who can be in and who can be out and who gets access and who doesn't. And violence is almost always the sort of go-to mechanism for that strategy. We talk a lot in our book, Policing Black Bodies, about lynching. Lynching is very much a racial equivalent of sexual violence. It's about power and control and access and controlling who can get in and who can get out, and what the penalty is for violating those norms and expectations that are produced hegemonically.
And related to that, on the global scale that we're talking about, Don and Mira ask about why US feminism is not as much about state impunity as Latin American and Mexican feminism.
Well, I would throw that back at Don and Myra, but I think my answer to that would be because they're social welfare states and we're not a social welfare state. And I think that, I don't mean to boil it down so simply, but I think that's another great example, another feminist sociological frame that helps us think about why the movements look different. And we don't think about that if we're not applying a sort of feminist sociological frame. We'd be stuck in the weeds of why somebody doesn't go to that protest or that protest, instead of thinking, how do we define ourselves as citizens? And I don't mean the term in terms of exclusion and inclusion, but am I part of a collective? And am I an individual? Am I working for the collective good, or am I working for what I personally want? But they're the experts on social movements. So I appreciate the question.
Myra, sorry, I mispronounced your name. While I wait, I think I'm lined up with all of the questions. All right, we've got some more in. Jessica says, thank you so much. Curious why such a framework focuses on a feminist lens and not an anti-racist feminist lens.
Absolutely an anti-racist feminist lens. Thank you, for sure.
Heather says, thinking about college campuses, in a weird way, it kind of feels like we have to less focus on the institutional structures and policies and more on getting students, staff, and faculty to shift their thinking and practices outside the boxes, a way to shift broader culture by pushing boundaries. I know we do this, but we also spend a lot of time on policy stuff, which you noted doesn't seem to be getting us very far. I've not thought about this all the way through, and I'm not sure at all if it makes sense. It just occurred to me as you were speaking. And I agree. I think there's multiple levels to shifting the policies and practices there.
Yeah, Heather, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think when we, one of the things we've been talking about in the Center for the Study and Prevention of Gender-Based Violence is when we focus, and we'll see what happens with a new administration, but I'm not super optimistic. When we focus on compliance, when we focus on teaching an individual behavior, count to 10, ask for permission, we're not focusing on the gender constructions and the gender expressions and the gender roles that produce the behaviors. So I think as long as, and universities want to focus on behaviors, they want to focus on things that you can teach in a workshop. And those are good, those are important things. But I think, yeah, and it's not going to come from the administration. Heather's right. It's going to come from grassroots. It's going to come from take women in gender studies classes, take sociology of gender classes, requiring courses like those for graduation would probably do more to change the conversation than than almost anything else that could come out of one of those offices. Because what happens in our classrooms, and I'm in a room with all of you who do this, what happens in those classrooms is transformative, and it has the potential to move those needles.
And she agrees everyone should be required to take those classes, what the students always say in the classroom.
Yep, absolutely. So that's one change you could advocate for on your own campuses, is include courses like this. And they have to be intersectional. They have to be also focused not just on gender inequality, but white supremacy, anti-Black racism, et cetera, et cetera. I think those courses, that's something that you could transform on your campus.
Earl asks at the end of the day, what is to be done?
Good question. I think what's to be done is, like we have calls for dismantling the carceral state, like we have calls to defund the police or de-escalate the military. I think we need to deconstruct the gender binary, and we need to deconstruct the hegemonic constraints that are associated with gender roles and gender prescriptions. And this is a long project, right? This is a long project. But I think if we could begin to do some of that work, we would actually begin to see change. It would begin to happen pretty quickly. We'd see pockets of it, at least, I think.
I think definitely pockets for sure, but I do agree with Mignon. To some degree, it is transformative for those who want to take the courses, but for those who are forced, they could be disruptive, and in the case of anti-racist courses, cause harm to others. But there is some comments in the chat that agree with you to redirect resources. And it can be tricky and counterproductive to bring everyone together in this type of setting if it can cause harm. So what do you think?
Well, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think we've never thought about, actually, I mean, I've been thinking about this question for a long time, but until Mignon asked this particular version of it, why do we assume that everyone takes the same class? Maybe we need, beginner, intermediary, and advanced courses so that we're not putting students who are more and less familiar with the topic. I mean, I don't want to put people who've never thought about anti-Black racism or never thought about patriarchy in a room with an advanced student, or I certainly don't want to put students who will harm other students in the same classroom together. So maybe we need to think more creatively about scaffolding a set of experiences and not teaching everyone in the same class or in the same even set of classes. I think that would be a really interesting project for all of us who are in higher ed and who think about higher ed to focus some attention on. What would that look like?
And I almost think, as a criminologist in a blended department of sociology, it's more about integrating these ideas and definitions and terms into our syllabi across courses, even in the department, right? So not just an explicit class that covers that, but starting to change the wheels a little bit. Francesca, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I think a movement toward that is things like normalizing people talking about their pronouns. That's a way that we begin to move the needle on those gender boxes. To your point, Kate, if we're doing it in all classes, on all syllabi, in all communication, and all interactions, then we're beginning to normalize that. And that, I think, is an example of where we might go with some of that stuff.
And there's some talk in the chat about getting the faculty on board and faculty development. Not keep putting everyone in 101, but what is also missing, Francesca points out, is a collective elaboration on the issue. So not just educating students, but staff, educators, faculty
Yes.
as well, which I think we're getting to a transversal conversation.
100%, absolutely, absolutely. 100%.
Great, we are lining up with the questions in the chat. So if anyone has any more thoughts, please send them along in the chat. Thank you for everyone's participation so far. I think it's been a very fruitful conversation. There's so many different directions that we can go, even starting from the beginning. There's so many different institutions we could talk about. While I'm waiting for, if there's any more, I can ask a question. I was thinking about when you were talking about the different institutions, politics and Hollywood were on there. And this may seem like a hard left, but in terms of Hollywood and actors, we're seeing a lot of current events in the news. with celebrities, and on the vein of anti-racist feminism, a lot of white male celebrities, Shia LaBeouf, Armie Hammer, these allegations of sexual abuse and intimate partner violence abuse. So what do you think about the combination of all of these institutions? So we've got the media and just institutional betrayal of the women that are affected by these allegations, and in such a spotlight, how do we support them in a public conversation about these topics?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think politics and Hollywood are are also in some ways like sports, because they're visible and people have their personalities and their behaviors are picked up on the local news and the national news and, you know, all those different places. And so how do we do that? I think, you know, my question back to Hollywood is, why do you reproduce gender role stereotypes in pretty much every movie that you make, in every film that you put out, in every commercial? You're reproducing exactly what I'm arguing tonight that we should be dismantling. And that's not, again, to take away from the experience of individual people, but to try to elevate the conversation about what's produced, who's behind the camera. I think the opportunities that somebody like Ava DuVernay has had, she's changing some conversations because some of the work that she's done, you know, but she's been at it for a really long time before she could even get enough money to fund a film. So how are the hegemonic ideologies and the power brokers at the top of those institutions shaping that as well? Not so much the individual behavior, but shaping the culture.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I was connecting those dots, even though they seem far away, because a lot of the Gen Z individuals that are in our college classes now are in high school and they're entering college. They look to media. So they're watching these movies and they are seeing these allegations and these stories on Instagram and Twitter. So if we change those structures and change those languages, as you were saying, I think that would make a difference. We're having a lot of talk in the chat about different ways that universities are improving the discussions and the conversations. Asher's favorite professor treats class as a learning opportunity for himself, the professor, and his students, pausing his lecture to listen to students. And that's the kind of learning environment that classes should be. I agree with that completely.
Absolutely.
Also, Earl says institutional masters could care less, put butts in the seats. We used to have strict guidelines on who took classes at the junior level, senior level, freshman, etc. Now anybody can take what they want.
Mm-hmm.
Roberta mentions that college courses and universities are, of course, important, but they also don't reach most of the population, which is another good point. The education and cultural focus has to be in schools to begin with. Waiting for college to open people's eyes is not really a good strategy.
100%. And one of the things that we're working on in the Center for the Study and Prevention of Gender-Based Violence is to, in fact, we just got news a couple of days ago that we've been selected as one of, I think, 4 programs at the University of Delaware that's doing a year-long set of seminars with K through 12 teachers. And so Dr. Nacarelli and I are pretty excited about being able to have some of these conversations with teachers who will infuse this into their classrooms from kindergarten all the way up through senior year in high school. That's where look, the needle has to move even earlier than that. You know, walk down the toy aisle in Toys R Us. You know, we had a conversation about how should you allocate household duties by who's good at it, who likes to do it. Why is Toys R Us organized by gender instead of by developmental stage? So you don't walk in Toys R Us and say, oh, I'm looking for the 0 to 3 month toys. You walk in Toys R Us and everything is pink and blue and it's all segregated. So right there, we're sending we're creating those boxes and enforcing and reinforcing and policing those hegemonic ideas about gender. So absolutely, yes, college is way too late to start.
And I think that Heather makes a good point, expanding on what you're saying, not just the other teachers in other grades, but also everyone taking it home to their kids and organizations and other communities that they engage.
Absolutely, absolutely.
A little earlier in the chat, I just want to redirect everyone, if you have not seen it, to Nancy shared a syllabi checklist that requires intersectional student learning outcomes, which is a great resource at UNM, requiring the credits to include lower division and upper division credits. So there's a link to the syllabus in there for the resource.
Nice.
We're kind of wrapping up. Susan does make a good comment, like you kind of talked about earlier. Everyone in America worships football. Near her home and mine as well in Baltimore, right next to the Ravens training practice. There's a practice field for Pee Wee football. Parents walk little boys by her home who can hardly stand under the football pads and helmet. The girls practice cheerleading at the same time. It's just an annual fall ritual.
Yep. Yep, exactly. Exactly.
Nancy, thank you for letting us know. There's a new membership category for high school teachers and held to pre-conference workshops with high school teachers last year on intersectionality and this year on transnational feminism. Teachers from New Mexico, California, Florida, Georgia have participated in SWS workshops.
Excellent. Yay. That's awesome.
Joan,
That's something for us as an organization to expand, right?
and record numbers for this year, as Barrett mentioned. So it's very exciting.
Excellent.
Joan asks, does the expansion of digital time for children during COVID affect gender-based violence socialization?
That's a great question. I do not feel at all equipped to answer that. I think that, what we know is that rates of gender-based violence and child abuse are increasing during COVID for all of the kind of obvious reasons, like hypersurveillance at home. I've been hearing stories about kids not being able to missing child abuse cases because kids aren't showing up at school where someone would notice. So about digital, probably depends on what they're watching, what other messages they're getting. It's a great question.
And
a great question.
Kids are seen on YouTube, kind of.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would assume yes. I would assume that, the wonderful thing about platforms like YouTube is any one of us can put our stuff up there. The terrible thing about YouTube is any one of us can put our things up there, right? So that we are exposed to, there's, it's possible to see literally everything. And I think that is cause for concern, especially as parents are busy home learning their students, their kids. They may not be able to supervise as well. I'm deeply worried about how all of this, TikTok. Yeah, TikTok. Probably that's a great question for someone who's in a younger generation than I am. But I think that I can imagine that all the same messages that come out through Hollywood are coming out through TikTok. And so again, until we disrupt those messages and that messaging and those constructions, those hegemonic constructions, it's going to be everywhere. It's going to be everywhere.
And you can find anything on TikTok. There's like a very far-reaching, unregulated nature to that social media platform. We are wrapping up. Our discussion will end in about 1 minute scheduled for. So Angie, I want to give the mic to you. If there's anything else, thank you so much everyone for a great discussion. I learned a lot from everyone and from Angie from your talk. So I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Kate, for moderating. You did a really fantastic job. I want to mention Kate and Allison are both on the job market again. So if you're looking for someone fantastic, but again, I'm humbled and incredibly privileged to be in this room and to have this opportunity to share the work that I've been doing, the things that I've been thinking about, and just to get the feedback from such amazing folks. And I appreciate everybody. It's been nice to see all of you, and thank you.